Welcome, everyone. My name is Celine Figueroa, and I am a program specialist at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. Thank you all for taking the time to join us tonight. We are so excited for tonight's program and to welcome Dr. Alan Titus. Dr. Titus works for the Bureau of Land Management as the Paria District Paleontologist, coordinating and engaging in the exciting research taking place in the late Cretaceous of southern Utah. He is the former monument paleontologist for the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument, a position he held for 19 years. In his off time, Dr. Titus enjoys hiking, cycling, playing the guitar in his classic rock cover band named the Mesozoic, of course, and daydreaming of what it would have been like to live in the Cretaceous period. Welcome, Dr. Titus. I will hand over the microphone to you, but for those watching, if you could open up that chat, you might have some questions that pop up. We absolutely encourage them. We will have a designated Q&A section at the end of tonight's program where we will answer as many of your questions as we can. So feel free to pop them through as they come and we will get to them at the end. Thank you all so much.
Okay, well, thanks, Selena. It's wonderful to have that introduction, and I'm really pleased to be here talking to everybody through the Denver Museum, and appreciate the lecture series they sponsor and all the good things they're doing even amidst these difficult times. So I'm happy to be here to talk about our research through the Denver Museum, who is actually one of our major partners. So hats off to the museum for sponsoring this. Just as a little bit of background, I've been the paleontologist here in southern Utah through the BLM for about 20 years. It was 20 years last May. And during that time, it's been essentially a nonstop process of discovery where we've been able to essentially uncover a whole ecosystem that we didn't know existed before the Grand Staircase was created. And we've had some key players in this partnership to get this new ecosystem documented in the late Cretaceous. Among them are the Natural History Museum of Utah in Salt Lake City and the Denver Museum of Nature and Science in Denver there. And so I just wanted to point out that without their support and the support of many other researchers at many other institutions, too many to name, that a lot of this knowledge wouldn't have come about. So I want to thank all of the partners we've had over the years and for those partners we'll have in the future. So tonight I want to talk about one particular discovery that I actually made back in 2014, and it turned out to probably be one of the most scientifically important finds I'll make in my career, unless I get exceedingly lucky. And you'll see more about that here in the presentation. With that, I'm going to go ahead and start my presentation. Hang on. And so if I could get some feedback, can you all see that? Okay, all right, so you can see this. So it's the title of my talk will be In the Land of Rainbows and Unicorns, Forensic Science of a 76.4 million year old Tyrannosaur Mass Mortality. Tonight, I want to walk you through the discovery of this amazing site, talk a little bit about its significance in terms of just the overall quantity of fossils there, and also one of the main conclusions that we've drawn from the site about Tyrannosaur behavior, given that we've weighed a lot of evidence, pro and con, about this group of tyrannosaurs found together, whether they died at the same time or whether they came in one at a time and died sort of randomly. All right. So without any further ado, I will roll on to the next slide. Tyrannosaurs and T-Rex in general have frequently been portrayed as, hang on. Let's see, as lone predators, as sort of solitary predators that didn't have the brain power necessarily to organize themselves into complex social groups. And they're frequently depicted in artwork as solitary predators, maybe pairs, like a bonded male and female, but typically solitary. And this isn't just artistic license taken up by paleo artists. It's actually supported by many researchers whom I've had conversations with that just don't believe that the Tyrannosaur brain would have been capable of the sort of higher level thinking that would allow them to organize into groups with mentoring and social hierarchies and sort of role divisions in hunting and courtship and nesting and things like that. They would equate their behavior more with that of a modern alligator or crocodile, which are not asocial animals, especially during the mating season. The males gather harems and things like that, but they don't really cooperatively hunt, and they're not organized in quite the complex way that a pack of wolves or a pride of lions would be. However, there is all this scientific evidence, or I should say fossil evidence, that's starting to paint a picture of tyrannosaurs habitually gathering together. The oldest known grouping of tyrannosaurs together is from the Yixian Formation in China 125 million years ago. We have a pair of Eutyrannus fossilized together, essentially with their tails touching, and preserved in incredible detail in this lake bed smothered in an ash volcanic eruption. Beautiful feathers preserved on these animals, so we know at least as far back as 125 million years they had feathers. And there's some hint that here are two animals associating with each other that were killed during a catastrophic event. So artists' reconstruction of Eutyrannus are showing them as these sort of social or parasocial animals. And then there's this place. This is Dry Island Buffalo Jump in Alberta, Canada, where they discovered the remains of at least 24 Albertosaurus, Tyrannosaur dinosaurs buried together in a single catastrophic event, concluded by the researchers to be a flood. They were essentially drowned together. This is a somewhat pixelated picture of the quarry in operation, and a really incredible world-class site in which you have a number of tyrannosaurs of different ages buried together during what appears to be a single catastrophic flood burial. And then most recently, there's been the report of a track site in the Wapiti Formation in British Columbia, where multiple sets of tyrannosaur footprints walking parallel with each other at the same time on the same bedding plane appear to show an aggregation of tyrannosaurs all heading the same direction together. And the authors of this paper actually argue that this site does evidence gregariousness, habitual gregariousness among tyrannosaurs. So there's track evidence and there's bone bed evidence. This is a map of the track site, and you can see three individuals here paralleling each other with a smaller theropod running sort of the opposite direction. Right? He's probably trying to get the heck out of there. So the question remains, then are tyrannosaurs going to behave more like a wolf pack or a pride of lions where they're sharing prey, there are hierarchies, there's actually role divisions in hunting and other behaviors, mentoring of the young, extended parental care, things like that? Or are they essentially more like alligators and crocodiles where there's some limited parental care, sort of minimal social interaction outside of the mating season, and it's sort of all for, or everyone for himself. And the argument then could be, if this gregariousness is shown to be a pervasive behavior among all tyrannosaur groups, or at least among disparate tyrannosaur groups of various ages, various places and times, then perhaps it reflects an innovation in their behavior that accompanies the general enlargement of the brain within the Coelurosaur dinosaur group, which includes Maniraptorans, which ultimately lead to birds and which we know are very social, including things like the Harris hawk. And this brings me then to 2014. We'd had a rainstorm and a little rill had been cut where the white line is indicating on the PowerPoint here. And exposed in that rill was the ankle bone of a really large tyrannosaur, and it's called an astragalus. It was in two pieces, but it was sitting right at the surface. And as we started to brush around the astragalus, we uncovered this right away. This is an enormous toe bone, several inches long, actually close to 7 inches long, from an adult tyrannosaur, basically a full-grown adult, a somatic adult. And in the immediate vicinity of that, we continued to find additional bones. Here are multiple tail vertebrae and a shattered femur from a juvenile tyrannosaur just a few feet away from that giant toe bone. So we knew right away we had multiple individuals, large and small. And then we went to excavating. We've spent the last 5 years excavating this site. It's estimated to be over an acre of bone. And the catalog of animals from the site is staggering. You know, we've got eight species of turtle. I'll get into that a little later. Numerous fish remains, and on and on. Just a staggering array of diversity and quantity and quality and rarity of animals in this site. So we got to excavating it right away. We brought in some heavy machinery to help us get the big blocks out. What's being lifted out here by this excavator is the nearly complete torso of a Deinosuchus alligator, one of the largest, actually the largest alligator type animal that ever lived in North America. This is a juvenile, but we have a nearly complete one from the site. So really, really staggering array of wonderful animals in beautiful states of preservation. It's so good that it got the nickname the Rainbows and Unicorns Quarry. This was actually tongue-in-cheek because I'd been known to exaggerate the quality of sites before. So one of my former lab managers was needling my field hand, and he said, look, how cool is this site? Come on. We all know with Alan, everything's rainbows and unicorns all the time. And he said, in this case, it really is rainbows and unicorns, and the name stuck. So I like this little meme off the internet. It's called Welcome to the Internet. And it became sort of the symbol for the site, if you will. Okay, let's talk about a little bit of the site geology. So we have a geologic map here that shows the location of the site right in the northwestern portion of the Kaparowitz Plateau. So the Kaparowitz Plateau is about a 1 million acre landform right in the middle of Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument. The northwestern portion is underlain by the youngest Cretaceous layers, and the red star marks the location of the site I'm talking about tonight within the Kaparowitz Formation, which is the youngest really fossiliferous Cretaceous unit in the region. There is one more Cretaceous unit above the Kaparowitz, known as the Canaan Peak Formation, which may actually extend up into the Maastrichtian, close to the actual extinction of the dinosaurs. But the Kaparowitz is essentially all of the late Campanian, from about 76.9, almost 77 million years to just shy of 72, about 72.5 million. So it represents nearly all the late Campanian stage, which is the second to the last stage in the Cretaceous. Exceedingly beautiful fossils throughout the Kaparowitz. The Denver Museum has dug many sites with spectacular fossils, including turtles with soft tissue and clutches of eggs preserved inside them. We've found dinosaurs with their skin and their beaks and their claws preserved as impressions around them. And many, many new kinds of dinosaurs never before seen in North America. So it's a really exciting place to be working. And of course, I'm focusing on this one site, the Rainbows and Unicorns site, or quarry, which is what RUQ stands for. So moving along into the geology, we need to put everything into a big context before we move into the nitty-gritty of the site. And so I'm going to do that right now. The site itself is located about 140 meters above the base of the Kapowitz Formation. So it's, that would put its estimated age at about 76.4 million years old. Okay, because the base is about 76.9, so we extrapolate about how fast the sediments were accumulating based on the few radiometric dates we have from dated ash beds in the sequence, and we can estimate an age of about 76.4. Could be 76.6, could be 76.3, but that's our best guess. So that's the context, age-wise. Now let's look at the details of the actual site geology, or the rock layers. And it became obvious right away that we were essentially dealing with two different sequences at the site, and it was a mystery how we got all the bones into the second sequence, because the first sequence, which seems to be the source for the bones, really didn't have much in it. There was a second sequence on top that was loaded with bones and little pebbles, and it qualified as a rock we call a conglomerate. And so I'm going to spend the next few minutes explaining the relationship between these two sequences and what we've interpreted them to represent in terms of ancient environments. I'm going to start with sequence 1 at the bottom, which is where geologists like to start because that's the beginning of the story. The lower sequence, of course, is that sequence which occurred first. What do those rock layers tell us? Well, they're mostly finer grained at the top, meaning they have very small clay particles which only settle out in still water. So we're looking from bottom to top at that sequence that's bracketed as 1 as representing a decreasing energy in a water environment. So the unit at the bottom is coarser grained, it's a medium sandstone, it implies some sort of current or flow. And then that flow slacks over time and creates a situation, an environment in which only fine particles are settling out of still water. Well, there's several ways to do that. One is to have a river abandon its channel and create something we call an oxbow lake. And then it transitions from flowing water with sandbars to a standing lake where you're getting nothing but mud, okay? And then there's this really dramatic, undulating, rough surface at the top of 1, in which there's clear vertical relief cut into it. It's like somebody dug a trough through the number 1 sequence and imposed the overlying sequence, which I'll get to in a second. Now, when you look at the details of number 1, of the sequence 1, there are some interesting features. So there are actually little white blobs seen in the photograph of rock in the upper left of the 4. So if you look at the upper left rock illustrated there in the presentation, it's got these little white blobs in there. And those little white blobs are actually calcium carbonate. They'll fizz with acid, and they are essentially caliche balls. So they represent the formation, or the incipient, the beginnings of the formation of a soil. So whatever wet environment produced the clay eventually dried out and allowed the precipitation of a caliche ball below the surface. And that's going to become important to our story later on, you'll see. Okay, so what would we interpret that sequence to represent? Essentially, it's a situation in which a former river channel or an area next to a river channel has become stagnant. It stopped flowing. And this is an example of such in South America. So you've got an abandoned channel on a river that's now essentially a long snaky lake, and you've stopped depositing sand in there, and now you're getting clay. So our best guess, our best interpretation for that sequence would be an abandoned channel on a river, or alternatively, a lake located very close to a river channel in which you're getting sands entered in by what we call crevasse splay flooding events during peak flooding. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next sequence and talk about sequence 2, which is the upper one and the one that contains all the bone. I should have mentioned that sequence 1 does contain rare chunks of turtle shell and fish scales and things like that. So there are actually fossils, but they're uncommon and only aquatic. We haven't seen any dinosaur bone in there. But you get to sequence 2 and the character completely changes. You notice the grain size is much larger. As you move from left to right in the little columns A, B, and C, the grain size is actually increasing, indicated by the distance from the left out to the right. So you're going from conglomerates with larger pebbles and little pea-sized grains up into a sand, and that sand persists. Essentially, it just transitions to sand, and the structures in the sand indicate that these are actually sandbars in a river channel. So we've now transitioned from slack water back to flowing water, and flowing water with some energy, some, it's a vigorous current, perhaps. So how do you do that? Well, you always have the river channels changing course, and they're eroding into what we call the cup bank and shifting positions constantly. And so what has happened is that the cup bank has now come back across a former channel and essentially cannibalized it and chewed it up, and is now superimposing a new channel deposit on a former abandoned channel. Okay, it's essentially reincarnation for rivers, and it happens all the time. This is not an unusual phenomenon. Now, what we do see, if you look at the photos down on the bottom there, starting with the upper right, is that the bottom unit is full of those little white balls, those little caliche balls, and clay particles clearly derived from something underneath, as erosion excavated the former abandoned channel or flood basin lake. So these are concentrates. They're essentially winnowed pebbles and carbonate balls and clay chunks that are being reincorporated into the new channel as it scours and gouges into the former lake. And we think that's exactly where the bones came from as well, that the bones themselves, which are almost all found in Unit 2, were similarly derived. Now, I can't prove that at this point. I'll have evidence for that later, and I hopefully will convince you that's true. But that was our suspicion going into it, is that all of the wonderful tyrannosaur fossils and turtles and fish and all that were actually in the lake and have been exhumed and reinterred in these sandbars. And then in Unit 5, you can see some bone. The picture in the lower left labeled Unit 5, there's actually a bone fragment there. And then Unit 6 is just sort of medium grain, homogeneous sandbar deposits without much in the way of fossils. Okay, so that's sequence 2, which we interpret as an active river channel right here. Something similar, again, to something you'd see as a tributary to the Amazon in South America. But these big curvy bends in the rivers are a result of the river's dynamic nature and the fact that it's always carving its way through the landscape and creating new pathways for itself, and then abandoning these tortuous channels when it becomes so difficult for the water to flow all the way around this big tear-shaped loop. So you get these things abandoned all the time. All right, let's look at some details within the quarry itself, some very interesting clues that the forensic paleontologist needs to pay attention to. This next figure shows 6 different features, key features from the site that we observed, starting with A in the upper left. The bottom of Unit 4, that pebbly unit, is paved with fish scales. Thousands upon thousands of little bits of fish, vertebrae and scales and skull fragments and parts of fins and things like that. So there appears to be a huge mortality among fish at some point. It seems beyond the scale of just normal dying on the day-to-day life of a lake. And then B, over on the upper right, shows the sort of undulating features that Unit 4 and 5 seem to have carved into the underlying 3. You know, that there's this extreme vertical relief in the relationship between 3, 4, and 5 that we would interpret to represent scouring or erosion prior to the deposition of 4 and 5. Then down to C on the center left, really interesting, locally lots of bits of charcoal, literally burned wood. This isn't carbonized wood from fossil trees. This was actual burned wood from a forest fire 76.4 million years ago. And it was scattered throughout the site among the tyrannosaurs and everything else. Now D is a support argument for the whole calcium carbonate ball argument. You've got roots penetrating, so that black stain sort of running vertically through the center right picture is the impression of a tree root or a shrub root running vertically right down through the underlying unit 3. So that's evidence that the lake or whatever hosted all these turtles and fish actually dried out and was colonized by plants. That's an important piece of evidence. And if it dried out, that's when your calcium carbonate sort of soils would have started to form. Now, very interestingly, some of the bones, as you see in the lower left in photograph E, actually have that same calcium carbonate inside them. So the process of forming a soil was able to actually crystallize calcium carbonates in the caliche in the pore spaces of the bones and also around them as sort of rinds. So that's clear indication that the bones were residing in an environment in which they could pick up calcium carbonate like that, which they wouldn't do in a river channel. They had to be sitting in a calm, dry floodplain sequence, you know, colonized by plants and roots and things. And then lastly, on the bottom right, you see these fine grain rocks, very similar to Unit 3, filling in pore spaces in some of the bones, indicating that their original internment, the original burial, was in a fine grain rock, very similar to 3. Maybe not identical to it, but very similar. So all of these add up to a very clear picture of where the bones may have originally been buried. So it looks like we've had a grave robber at work, digging these things up and relocating them. Now, the orientation of the bones themselves are also clues. So we very carefully map the spatial relationships, mostly in 2 dimensions, in this quarry map here. And it turns out there's a very clear indication of current. So if you look at the red circle on the bottom right of this map, there's a long axis pointing sort of to the upper left and lower right. That means that any bone that had a long axis to it has been lined up in that direction. So a lot of things like ribs and the skulls and foot bones and leg bones that have long dimensions to them, they're longer than they are wide, they tend to get oriented one of 2 directions when current will move them. And that the fact that their orientation in this map is not random, but actually oriented towards the northwest, southeast, with a secondary component pointing sort of northeast, southwest, indicates clear movement with the influence of a current. So that's counter to the original depositional environment, which we think was slack water. I'm going to keep rolling here. Whoops. All right, looking at some of the faunal elements as arguments for the history of the site. On the upper left, you see snails and a tiny little clam. So there are actually, there's a gastropod, a snail, freshwater species, right in the middle of the picture, a little spiral there. And above that, right above it, there's a little flat oval shape. That's a baby freshwater mussel. And we saw large snails in both units 3 and in the overlying unit 4, and they were probably related to each other in terms of source, but the clams were small. And they were so small that it would suggest that this lake didn't have a very long history as a standing body of water. because if it had, then these clams would have gotten to be several inches long. So they grow fairly slowly, but if the lake persisted for decades and decades, these clams probably would have been a lot bigger than the 1 inch to 1.5 inch specimens we found. Looking at B in the upper right, there's an articulated section of the largest bony fish, the largest, teleos fish, sort of the flexible, modern tarpon-like things. And then there were lots and lots of turtles. And in C, in the center left, there's actually 3 complete large Neuranchylus turtle shells in that photo, with a portion of a 4th one. So with just heaps of giant turtles, including the largest probably freshwater turtle that ever lived in the Cretaceous of North America, whose lower jaw is pictured in D in the center right. This was a shocker. We found the remains of an animal whose shell may have approached 1.5 to 2 meters in diameter, with a skull the size of a volleyball. You know, this is as big as a modern leatherback sea turtle living in this lake context. And then we also have our Deinosuchus, the lower left. There's 2 armored plates off the back of our fairly complete Deinosuchus that you saw being pulled out with the excavator. And then an array of tyrannosaurs in multiple size ranges, 4 of which are illustrated by toe bones in the lower right. These are gastroliths, we believe. There was a really bizarre, totally out of context pile of Paleozoic limestone pebbles and almost cobbles, actually. These are cobble-sized rocks in a nice little pile just outside the torso area of that Deinosuchus. So the animal was not articulated, but in close anatomical order, and these pebbles were just within a meter of its rib cage. So we believe these are actually almost in situ gastroliths outside of the big alligator's belly. And then the largest tyrannosaur we would estimate to be about 27 to 30 feet long. And this is a right face, the right side of the face of the skull of the largest individual. So in this picture, you can see the back of the eye represented by that postorbital bone. You can see the jugal, which is the cheekbone, and the entire right maxilla with some teeth sticking out down to the bottom center. And then the nasal process ascending up on the top towards the postorbital. And then the lacrimal, which forms the front of the eye, is just outside the skull, off to the right at the right edge. So it just got displaced about a meter. And then nearby, within a meter, was also the nasal bone, which would rest on the crown of the upper jaw, going up towards the top of the eye, or the crest of the eye. So a relatively complete right side of the face of the largest tyrannosaur, plus other bones, including parts of the lower jaw. Oops. So you really did have Raoul Martin's classic National Geographic picture of Deinosuchus terrorizing the tyrannosaurs. This actually happened in southern Utah, and we've got the fossil evidence to show these animals interacted. They were in the same ecospace. I thought that was pretty cool. All right, well, let's get to some real science here. So we decided that the geology was a great argument, but we wanted to know what some of the stable isotopes might tell us about the relationships of both the rocks in units 3 and 4, which might give us some clue as to the history of the bones, as well as the relationships of the animals to each other. So we ran a number of samples from the little carbonate pebbles in both the clay unit of number 3 and the overlying conglomerate in unit 4 to see if there was any kind of match or pattern or disparity that might tell us whether or not we were completely out to lunch in our hypothesis that the fossils were locally derived. And then we analyzed a number of turtle shells to see if they were coming out of the same ecospace, living together essentially in the same sorts of water, or if they had been washed in from various places and sources, and that would be reflected in very different isotopic signatures in their shells. So looking at the top diagram, I'm going to first start with the analysis of the Unit 3. We analyzed two components in the white blebs, the white carbonate pebbles in Unit 3. We did the fine grained stuff, and that's shown with green triangles, which may not be discernible on your screen. I don't know if you can actually make out that color, but you got the fine grained stuff, and then you have little fractures filled with really coarse crystals, which happened later. That's called the spar, and that actually came much after these animals were buried and when the rock forming processes start. So we very carefully decided to analyze those separately to see if they differed, and they did. So when you look at the isotopes of, for instance, stable oxygen, this O18, it turns out the oxygen in the Unit 3 pebbles clusters fairly closely together at between -8 and -7 parts per thousand. Sorry, parts per 100. So that's fairly close. They seem to all group together in a nice tight cluster within reason that they're all reflecting origins of the same sort of water system. When you look at, and then their carbon content is about -9, centered around -9. When you look at the carbonate pebbles in the overlying Unit 4, their isotope signature for oxygen is well within the average. In fact, it's close to the average for the pebbles in Unit 3. So you can show that they share a similar origin in terms of the waters that were growing the crystals of calcium carbonate, but their carbon signature, the C13 signature, is actually heavier. So it's only a -7.5 compared to that -9. And so that shows a clear difference. And I'll explain why we think that is in a minute. Going down to the lower graph, within reason, all of those turtle shells reflect the same exact water conditions. So we were really happy to see that the turtles seem to all have been living together happily in one lake system. The isotopes line up very nicely. They all agree within reason with these whisker box plots that they were in the same ecospace. The one outlier is that really giant turtle, and it's possible that it was living somewhere else and got washed in. He's a little actually heavier than the other turtles. Okay, so how do you get the differences in the carbon and yet maintain the same oxygen signatures in those pebbles between Units 3 and 4? Well, here's our interpretation. Oops, so the red bar there is showing how all the turtles kind of line up, sorry. So it turns out that you can precipitate the same carbonate nodules from the same waters in the subsurface, and yet because of plant respiration, the carbon signatures can be dramatically different between the deeper and shallower parts of a soil horizon. In fact, it turns out that the carbon tends to get heavier as you go towards the surface because plant respiration actually will lighten the bottom. So you have a lighter layer below, and it gets heavier as you go towards the surface, and there's more interaction with the atmosphere. So what's happening is the plants go down, and they actually are interacting with the carbon in the soil and preferentially taking 13 out and lightening it. Whereas the closer you get to the surface, the atmospheric, sorry, my hand's getting in the way, the atmospheric carbon is coming in and making it a little heavier. So what we think happened is The bones were derived from a higher horizon that was closer to the surface and therefore had this heavier carbon signature versus lower where they would have had a lighter carbon signature, and yet within reason, the carbonates, the oxygen in the carbonates is very, very close. So we see this as essentially one system with the stuff in Unit 4 being derived slightly higher in the soil profile. That's the only difference we could tease out of that. So onto the charcoal. One of the more intriguing parts of our story here was a fire involved in the death of these animals. Well, we analyzed numerous samples of charcoal. It turned out to all be essentially burned redwood. So these are chunks of redwood trees that were down. There was a lot of evidence of fungal rot in these samples. And so we're probably looking at dead and down wood rather than the burning of live trees. And according to the reflectance, which is a way to measure the intensity of the fire using certain techniques with scanning electron microscopes and light, the estimated temperatures were actually at the lower end of any fire. So these are more or less smoldering, low temperature fires burning dead and down wood. They're not catastrophic crown fires that would sweep through and maybe clean out a forest and leave it sterile in its wake. There certainly was a sizable fire, but maybe not an epic fire. When you look at the weathering on the bones, and these charts are actually somewhat obsolete. I've recalculated our data, so these charts are just something to look at, but I'll give you the outcome of my reanalysis here as we're staring at these charts that don't mean all that much anymore. It turns out that almost all of the bone at the site is pristine. There's been a system that's used to characterize the weathering or the destruction of bone, and it grades from 0 to 5, 0 being there's still meat on them and it's still pristine, and 5 is basically it's broken up into tiny little chunks and almost unrecognizable. And most all of the fossil material from this site would rank as a 1. There were a few instances of 2s and 2 instances of 3s where the bone had actually started to disintegrate. And both of the 3s were hadrosaurs. So they were other kinds of dinosaurs. So these plots are showing these wide spreads of 3s in the tyrannosaurs and things like that. That's not true. I had to go back through and reevaluate the data, and virtually everything is a 1. There's a handful of 2s and there's 2 3s. So overall, the bone at the site is pristine, which it would not be if it sat out on the surface and was scavenged and rotted for a long time. This indicates quick burial. However, this contrasts with pervasive fracturing. Almost all the bones are riddled with rectangular fractures. And it's difficult to explain such pervasive fracturing if there was almost no surface time allowing it to rot and disintegrate, unless the fracturing was occurring in the subsurface. And it turns out that if you repeatedly wet and dry bone in the subsurface, it will go through the same process of shrinking and cracking that bones will do at the surface. But they don't reflect the surface erosion and the spalling or the destruction of the surface that you would have if that bone had actually sat on the surface. So if you follow me, these bones were buried quickly, but once they went underground, they were repeated to numerous wetting and drying cycles that caused them to shrink and swell and fracture. And then when they were exhumed and reburied, they had these inherent cracks all through them, and the pressure of being reburied actually shattered many of them. So you can see there's a metatarsal, no, sorry, that's a tibia in the left under A, and it's just shattered like broken glass. And yet this is a very strong, robust bone in the animal. And if it had been buried right away and not experienced any mechanical failure, that's hard to do just by weight of sand alone. It had to go into that burial event with pre-existing weaknesses. Even the teeth of the tyrannosaurs had these rectangular fractures, which is really unusual. These are compact, dense, hard structures that are almost impossible to shatter under normal conditions, but they were cracked with the same rectangular fractures, which we think they inherited from an extended wetting and drying period in a soil. There has been some experimental work done that demonstrates this is possible. There's been studies on flamingo bones at the edge of lakes in Africa, and if they repeatedly wet and dry, they start to develop these same rectangular fracture patterns, these sort of lengthwise patterns. And similar patterns have been observed on pig bones buried and exposed to repeated wetting and drying. And also experimentally in the lab, they've been able to wet and dry things hundreds of times in accelerated cycles and create these same fractures. So we're fairly confident that we at least have an explanation for the pervasive fracturing in the bones. So that's essentially our taphonomic or forensic analysis. Now I'd like to go through a summary and talk about what we've learned and what we might be able to conclude from all of this evidence. 1, we definitely have evidence that the tyrannosaurs were buried in a quiet, slackwater, fine-grained context, and these were associated with lots of fish and turtle remains. Why do I say that? Because we have the actual remnants of that fine-grained material in the nooks and crannies of the tyrannosaur bones, and it couldn't have got there any other way than if it's left over from their original internment. The association with the fish and turtles seems fairly obvious because that's what's in the bed. I didn't mention it earlier, but there's enormous numbers of garfish and bowfins, which are both low oxygen tolerant fish species. And then you also have the isotopes indicating that the turtles and the fish lived in the same ecospace. So they're not being washed in. So we're gonna hypothesize then that maybe all of these things lived in the same ecospace. There's something called a Voorhees group analysis, and it basically says that you've got little things and you've got big things and they're all there together. It would indicate that they haven't moved very far from their original point of burial, or they haven't been transported, because if you did, you would start to sort things by size. The large things would get left behind and the small things would get carried away, the small lighter things. So because we have all these very fine, tiny little bones associated with really large bones of the same animal, it indicates there's almost no transport involved when these things were exhumed and reburied. So that takes us to a process of winnowing rather than deep erosion and transport. So whatever occurred, it more resembled just a winnowing and sweeping away of the fine sediment and then reburial, rather than a violent ripping out of the lake and transport downstream somewhere else. These things are almost in the same places that they were in when they were buried the first time. You do get turtles and gastropods in Unit 3, which could potentially tie them to all the gastropods and turtle fossils that we see in Unit 4 associated with the tyrannosaurs. The second thing is that we have 5 growth stages from very young to fully grown adults represented at the site. This is unusual. I mean, we see that at the Albertosaurus site in Canada, but a lot of large dinosaur like theropod death assemblages like Cleveland Lloyd, they tend to focus on one size group rather than tiny ones and really big ones. So this spread of ages is something we have hard evidence for, and also sort of unusual. Most of the fossils experienced rapid burial, indicated by the low numbers in their weathering index, that rating of 1, and yet were subjected to petagenesis, meaning that overprint of the calcium carbonate, and the roots penetrating down through, as well as repeated wetting and drying, which we think was what resulted in all that cracking, not krakens. The bulk of the fossils then, because there's almost no transport shown, were just winnowed and buried then in this fluvial context within the river channel, with an orientation of current flow at about 314 degrees, basically northwest, southeast. And then finally, 5, we have a low temperature fire that occurred sometime between the deposition of units 3 and 4. Now, it is hypothetically possible that it occurred sometime before unit 3 and it was washed in from some distant source. But if it occurred locally, it seems likely, since we don't see it in unit 3 or any of the underlying units, that it was either present in a unit on top of 3 or happened after all of the units in the lake were born, and maybe even during the period at which trees were growing in the lake and the soil was forming. So you could have had a drought and a fire at that point in time. But parsimony says, if Joe Surdich is watching, that there was a low temperature fire sometime between the deposition of units 3 and 4. So here you go, drum roll please. Here's our synthesis of the site history. Stage 1, you have this abandoned channel of a fairly wide river system, and you have the deposition of these tyrannosaur carcasses in there during what we speculate was a flooding event, which has been identified as the same killing agent in the Albertosaurus site in Canada. Then you have layer upon layer, bury these things along with all the turtles and gars and ameids and other aquatic animals, the Deinosuchus that lived in the lake. And then at time 2, you actually have the death of the lake. It dried out, all the fish died. You may see that sort of acme or peak of gars and ameids at the end of the lake cycle when the oxygen in the lake got low. And then finally a fish mass mortality signals the very end of the lake. And then colonization by plants, and that's when the roots came through, and you also started to grow the caliche balls in and among the fossils, as indicated by that gray line that goes across the slide there. Of course, it could have happened at some other time, but we suspect that the fire actually occurred during a drought cycle after the lake was colonized by plants, and that the charcoal may have been in laying around on the surface of these sort of colonized or forested former lake beds. And then finally, the fire itself may have triggered the change in the course of the nearby river, because sometimes in the wake of fires, if you get a lot of logs or dead wood clogging channels, it can cause an avulsion or an actual spontaneous change of the channel and create erosional vents through former floodplain, thereby exhuming the lake, re-exhuming or exhuming the fossils and redepositing them on the margin of this channel, on the margin of the new channel, through a series of winnowing events. You got the charcoal all incorporated in there as it's being stirred up. And that would be then our argument for the site history. Now, what does this mean in terms of the tyrannosaurs? Well, let's look at that real quick. If you're looking at an attritional accumulation, or if these tyrannosaurs wandered into that lake one at a time and died there, you might expect to see certain things. One is you might expect the tyrannosaurs to exhibit different weathering stages, because the first one to be buried might be pristine, but if another one came along later and took a longer time to be buried, it might get to stage 2 or stage 3 even. You would expect the structure of the group for these attritionals to generally be similar age sizes or age classes or sizes. It's very unusual for a small group, for attritional groups to randomly draw among the very young and the very old. You know, typically you have lots of young males tend to be dumb and wander off and get stuck into things, say for instance, quicksand. And then also, is there any geological evidence for an environment that could sequentially trap these animals versus a catastrophic event? So examples of traps could be quicksand, drying mud holes where they could get mired. You could have a poison pond. You know, you could have them come down one at a time and drink at a pond and get poisoned through botulism, these sorts of things. So is there any evidence for that? Well, here's a mass mortality in Southeast Australia. You have numerous cows buried together, and these guys didn't die in a drought. They actually died in a flood following a fire at the end of a drought, which is, you know, possibly one of the, or no, sorry, we would have the tyrannosaurs buried before this. But anyways, you have a number of individuals of different sizes, different age classes, all buried together in one mass mortality event, which we think is what we see, or which is actually what we see at the Rainbow site. There's a very famous example of mass mortalities in Africa where the wildebeest try to cross the Mara River during flood stage, and these animals get drowned and washed downstream by the hundreds, if not the thousands. There's a beautiful iguana sitting on the body of one of them there. And then an overview of one of the pileups from these wildebeest mass mortalities. So all you need is some slack water for the carcasses to sort of drift into and accumulate. And in the case of an abandoned river channel, that'd be a natural drainage area for receding floodwaters to take carcasses of tyrannosaurs into. So our argument is they died together. The evolution of tyrannosaurs occurs right after the innovation in theropods of a much larger cranial capacity. In fact, that's one of the defining characters of tyrannosaurs and their cousins, the raptors. They all have enlarged brains over their carnosaur cousins. So with the larger brain, perhaps came innovative behavior. The behavior that's a step beyond what their theropod ancestors were capable of.
Dr. Titus, so sorry to interrupt.
Yep.
Just giving you a little time check. We've got about 3 minutes left in the program. We can go a little bit over that, but just so you can start to wrap up your
almost done.
thoughts.
I'm actually winding down here. Okay, thank you. So we've got a spread of ages, right? We've got a really small juvenile in about the 8-year-old range, all the way up to a somatic adult over 20 years of age, based on the curves of Erickson as modified later for these. This is for Daspletosaurus. We're projecting our animal on that. And the final argument I'd like to make is that tyrannosaurs are incredibly rare fossils in the comparators to begin with. It seems almost impossible that you would randomly trap all these animals together at various ages, like a baby and a full adult and a couple of teenagers and a middle schooler or a sixth grader all together at once. This is the best preserved tyrannosaur we've ever found. It was a nearly complete articulated specimen. It's the only one like it. We can count on 2 hands the number of beautiful specimens with skulls that we could identify as species. There may be a few dozen sites where there's chunks and bits of them, but that contrasts with the thousands of hadrosaur sites that we've documented out there. So in terms of the numbers of dinosaurs and the ratios of dinosaurs that lived in the ecosystem, it's more like 100 to 1 or 500 to 1. And so it seems almost to defy logic that you could bury 5 of these individuals together randomly, one after another. So we're sticking to our story that this actually represents gregariousness, that these animals were associating. It was multi-generational, and you can draw your own conclusions from that. Perhaps these animals were behaving at a slightly more complex level than a lot of tyrannosaur workers would like to give them credit for. And certainly that would be of the opinion of Dr. Phil Curry. Okay, so our animal is in the lower right, red arrow, Gorgosaurus and Gorgosaurus up in dinosaur or up in Alberta is a much lower grade animal, but you now have evidence for social gregariousness in two different groups spanning a lot of Tyrannosaur evolution. So maybe it's a very pervasive behavior. And you also have it in two widely varying geographic areas, one up in Canada and one way down south in the southern portion of the continent that was the ancient subcontinent Laramidia. So I think the tyrannosaurs died together. Their age disparity would suggest a more complex social relationship than pure random happenstance, and that it's possible that this represents pack behavior among tyrannosaurs, which is called pre-social, essentially. And that this is another piece of evidence that this behavior was actually pervasive throughout the entire family. Thank you very much. I appreciate you, and I would like to thank all those who have worked with us to get this project to where we have it today. And that's my presentation. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Dr. Titus. You can go ahead and stop sharing your screen.
Okay.
We're right at time, but I figured we could answer at least one question that was in the chat. I do think you did a fabulous job at answering a lot of those questions as they were coming. Some folks were asking about the aging process. You did a great job at explaining that. So, the singular question that stands.
I'm trying to get the Zoom to.
That's
let me
okay.
See here. Oh, I can't get it to stop sharing the screen.
That's okay.
Let me see.
But the question that I have for you is, and maybe we can do this. The question that I have for you is,
okay,
which prehistoric period would you visit if given the opportunity to do so in a safe way, and why?
Oh, the Cretaceous, without a doubt. So many things were happening in the Cretaceous that are fascinating to me personally. I'm very interested in ammonites, which are a form of shellfish that lived in the oceans, and I would love to beachcomb and pick up ammonite shells on a Cretaceous beach. I'm really interested in the innovations that were occurring ecologically with the radiations of flowering plants and birds and insects and a lot of things that we take for granted in the modern world. Oh, there we go. So I'm done. Yeah, I'm not sharing it, looks like, right? Okay. And I just think, to me, it's one of the most fascinating periods in Earth history. You know, the Paleozoic would be very interesting, the early Mesozoic, but those would be very foreign worlds. And the Cretaceous has just enough of a hint of familiarity for it to hold a lot of interest to me. You know, it's where so many things in our modern world were born, and yet still alien. So I like that combination of completely foreign alien with just the hint of familiarity with our modern world.
Thank you so much for that. Well, do you have any parting thoughts before we say goodbye to everybody?
Well, hope you enjoyed the presentation, and appreciate you all logging in. And I don't know if we're going to be able to do follow-up with questions later, or is that essentially it?
If folks are willing to stay for a little bit longer, the program is officially over, and I don't think we have anything scheduled. So some folks are heading out. That's absolutely okay. I can go through and just do a few questions that I pulled from the chat that you didn't.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that if people want to.
Awesome. Oh, look at that. We've got folks saying, oh, I'm staying. Thank you so much. So one of the questions that popped up in the chat a few different times was this idea, and you talked about it, you kind of breezed over it. Did Tyrannosaurs, I can't say it without the rec.
Yeah.
Did they have feathers? What evidence is there to suggest that one way or another? And if so, what did that look like?
Well, I did mention earlier in the talk that there's that find in China, this Tyrannus huali, that has beautifully preserved feathers on it from nose to tail. So this is a very early Tyrannosaur, and Since so many of the cousins of the tyrannosaurs, known as the raptors, have also been found with beautifully preserved feather fossils, it's reasonable to assume that tyrannosaurs had feathers. Now, whether or not that covered their entire body, like Big Bird, or whether it was just patchy, or whether they may have molted out of them when they got ginormous in size, is hard to say. But I will share something breaking. We have found skin on a tyrannosaur that we're currently excavating at a new site, and it's scaly. So you have to reconcile the evidence from Tyrannus with feathers, clearly feathers. And we're not talking about broad, flattened, fanning feathers like you'd see in a bird for flight. We're talking about things that are long, plumy, sort of stringy looking things, more like what you would see on the body of an ostrich or an emu, something like that. Something that's not for flight at all, but strictly for insulation. We do have some skin impressions from a tyrannosaur and its little diamond-shaped scales. So wherever that was on the body, they weren't universally covered with feathers.
That is fascinating. That is also news to me. I love learning more and more through these talks. Another question that we had, and it looks like you do have some folks saying hi to you in the chat, that you may have some colleagues from the excavation.
Yeah, folks from Denver have been out and assisted us with digs, so there might be a few friends in the audience there.
Well, some folks in the audience want to dive in a little bit deeper to this idea of plants and roots that you found. So what state do you find them in? Is it similar to, is the preservation similar to what we would see with dinosaur bones or casts? What does that look like?
Yeah, so one of the really interesting things that's not there, I mean, one of the most interesting things about the site is there's almost no, in fact, I haven't seen a single leaf or needle from a plant. Most of these sites that we dig up, where the two tyrannosaurs I'm working on right now, the sites are full of branches of redwood trees. You occasionally get palm fronds and sycamore leaves and other things associated with them because the context of the environment was constantly washing these plant remains in with the bones. We didn't see a single thing. All we've seen so far that I could identify as plant material have been the roots, the vertically preserved roots in Unit 3, and what I think are exhumed roots. They're these long cylindrical sections of sort of striated wood that's preserved almost two-dimensionally. They've been crushed flat and are essentially thin layers of carbon. But the outside surfaces of them don't suggest bark from a tree. I think they're actually roots. So it would suggest a landscape actually devoid of vegetation when that second burial occurred, which would fit with the evidence for a fire.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
So
does that help? Did that?
It absolutely
Okay.
does. I think that covered all three questions that we had about plants.
Okay, great.
So speaking of that fire and the way that you found that site, folks were wondering if there's any evidence of any of that site freezing over. So you mentioned wet and dry cycles. Is there any evidence of like ice cycles?
Okay, good question. Now it turns out that our isotope evidence from both this site and elsewhere in North America suggests that the climate was actually much hotter when these animals were alive. And even though the latitudinal position of North America, its north-south position hasn't changed a lot, it has shifted a bit. In fact, it's actually come south since then, just a bit. Even though it was in a mid-latitude geographically, the climate was borderline full-on tropical. So, we had way over 700 parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere at the time, which is over 300 parts per million more than today. That was enough to significantly heat up the planet, create sort of cool temperate conditions in the poles and full-on subtropical to tropical conditions in the southern US. So there wouldn't have been enough temperature variation seasonally to flood. if I could make an analogy with modern environments, you're probably looking at something like the upper Amazon basin or the Pantanal in southwestern Brazil, which would be very warm year round. So you'd have seasonal wet and dry, like a dry season and a wet season, but you wouldn't have freezing temperatures ever.
That is a great answer to that question. And if I'm looking down, it's because I have my little legal pad down here. It's where I've
Well,
been
if I'm staring off this way, it's because I'm looking at my screen of the presentation. Yeah.
So you dove into the way in which you're able to identify those different layers. There was a question in the chat. Somebody in the audience asked how reliable those dating methods that tell us that there were multiple tyrannosaurs inhabiting the same space or the common space. So can you dive a little bit more into how you know that those two creatures that were found next to each other were laying there next to each other and died next to each other?
Yeah. So the assumption would be that they're still in place. You know, I mentioned the fact that the little bones are still associated with the big bones, right? And when you do that, when you have that state at a site, you have to assume they haven't moved very far. And if you had eroded these things out of multiple feet of sediment, you know, if one was 6 feet up and the other was near the bottom, and you had to move 6 feet of sediment to get to the bottom one to finally exhume it and bury it again, the one at 6 feet would have been carried away. So we assume, since they're all still together and they haven't moved very far, that they had to be associated with each other in the original burial. So that's our evidence for that.
Thank you. And we've got just about 4 more minutes for questions. Okay. Looking down, somebody did just mention the idea that they traveled in packs. They mentioned that that is both impressive and terrifying. Are there any modern animals that do travel in packs that maybe might share traits with tyrannosaurs, what they may have been? Is there any evidence suggesting that, like, historic like evolution?
I am going to pull one out of my hat called the Harris hawk, Parabuteo. It is a hawk that lives in the Sonoran Desert in southern Arizona and northern Mexico, that lives in highly structured parasocial groups. They have alpha males, alpha females. They can be as big as 8 to 10 individuals. That's about the size limit. They have clear division of roles in terms of hunting and reproduction. They hunt cooperatively, and they have different roles in the hunt. Like, they'll have sentries, and they'll have somebody that goes into the ground to flush a jackrabbit. And it turns out that their ability to take down larger prey goes up exponentially. Their success ratios go up exponentially when they cooperate like this. So Harris hawks are birds. Birds are highly derived Maniraptorans. Maniraptorans are first cousins to tyrannosaurs. So this is a second cousin that's doing exactly what we think the tyrannosaurs may have been doing, albeit maybe not quite as sophisticated. So basically, the social structure and behavior of a Harris hawk is almost the same as a pack of wolves or a pride of lions. The whole cooperative hunting, division of roles, hierarchies, mentoring of the young, these birds do all of that. I think it's a perfect analogy.
That is fascinating. That was a very quick draw, so kudos for that. And I think the final question that we'll end on is, what factors offset bone breakage and quality? So you mentioned those dry and wet periods. What are some other things that make a site a good site? What are the conditions that make it the ideal conditions?
So the fortunate thing for us, at this site in particular, and at most of the sites we find in the Kaparowitz, is that they are getting re-exhumed. I mean, it's actually a saving grace. It doesn't preserve them in their original context, which is extremely frustrating because we're losing forensic evidence when they get exhumed and reburied. But the key to preserving a fossil long-term is getting it down below the water table. And that process I mentioned about it getting into the soil and wetting and drying and the little carbonate balls forming, that's the start of their death sentence. The bones would actually be destroyed if that process were allowed to continue uninterrupted. And so it was a godsend that the river channel changed its course, eroded these bones, dropped them down in elevation, and got them down below the water table again. It spared them complete destruction. So even though it's a curse in one way, and that it's depriving us of a lot of important scientific information, this recycling, this reincarnation, if you will, of the river channels and the way they affect the bones and dig them up and rebury them is actually getting them preserved by getting them below the water table, which is the single most important factor in getting a bone preserved in good condition. I've seen plenty of bones in the Caperoids that are on their way to becoming total garbage because they didn't have that. They resided in the soil for too long, and now they're just splintered, basically piles of garbage that a scientist can't get any data out of. So very important, but frustrating all at the same time.
What I'm getting from that answer is that this site really was the land of rainbows and unicorns.
Absolutely.
That was not an over-exaggeration on your part.
No, we got really lucky with this one.
Well, I am very grateful for that because this was a fantastic presentation.
Well, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
Absolutely. Would you like to say anything else before we sign off?
Well, just hello to all my friends out there in Denver Museum of Nature and Science land, and hope to see you out in the Caperoids again someday.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Dr. Titus. This was such an informative presentation. I am very grateful to have been your host. Thank you to everybody in the chat for such wonderful questions. I'm going to go ahead and share our farewell PowerPoint.
Okay.
But thank you all so much. We will see you all next time.
All right. Good night.
Good night.